Hey everybody, this is Ron. So, in the last episode, all about Steve, Dan and I got into a very long discussion about Asperger's, autism, anxiety, mania, and other stuff. So, instead of having it in the middle of the All About Steve episode, we pulled it out. So, here we are as Dan and Ron get personal.
But it's interesting that you're seeing, like, from early on as symptoms or let's say
Mm.
indicators of being on the spectrum, and I was seeing it as symptoms of being manic, because I know that when I
Mm.
start getting at least hypomanic, I
Mm.
get forced speech, so I'll talk fast
Mm.
and I have to get these things out. I have to say this, and sometimes, and this was when somebody like actually said, maybe there's something here. And I said that I sometimes talk so fast that I talk faster than I think. It's just
Oh
like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah. I mean, I
um,
remember when I was younger, I was I almost thought that like thought and speech were two distinct things.
uh-huh,
Like it was like a switch I could flick on and off.
uh-huh.
And I think that people around me, because I was referencing all this stuff, they were like, "Oh man, this guy's like thinking really hard about it," but it's almost like a physical reflex. Like I feel like a lot of times if I'm talking for a long time, it's coherent. There's a thought process there, but the thoughts are all the thoughts and the speech are merged. There's not like
Right,
a backstage conversation going on.
right, right.
Um,
Wait, this is interesting. Okay. I remember. Sorry. Help me.
oh,
I'm good.
don't worry.
I'm working through something. I think. Wow, there's a lot of stuff here. Working through the mind, and there's a lot of psychology here. And like,
Mm.
wait, okay, there's something here I need to kind of think through. So, I remember I used to worry, and I was actually kind of distraught, not despondent. I would get really distraught about that my thought process and my thinking didn't have words associated with them. So I'll have conversations in my head. I'll work some stuff out and I'll have conversations with people in my head. I know they're not there. It's not like that. It's
Well,
like, but
I did that all the time. I would have like shit. Did you ever watch The Tick in the '90s
yep, yep.
cartoon?
Well, I watched it. Oh no, I'm sorry. I watched the live action version. I watched some of that. I didn't watch the cartoon.
Oh, okay. So they would have these little bits at the beginning where he's answering questions from this unseen interview. He's just sitting in a chair in this completely dark room.
Uh-huh.
And when I was younger, I used to rehearse like lengthy, like I would have full two-sided conversations with myself in my head to the point where shit, I'm trying to think, like when I was in third grade, we had like 20 minutes of reading
Uh-huh.
and then we had to go to math. And I started reading and I was having this like dialogue in my head. 30 minutes into the math lesson, the teacher is like, "All right, we're going to bang the chalkboard erasers together to see if we can like get Dan to emerge from wherever his head is." And I did not realize the math lesson was going on for a full 30 minutes because I was like having this long conversation with myself in my head.
Wow. Wow, that's impressive.
It's
Again, I'm having a hard time. I want to say, a symptom versus indicator versus, symptom versus just
well, you're like rehearsing
a
the thing,
trait.
right? Because that was
Yeah.
like and I think like when you speak like because you sort of at least the way I understand why my brain is doing that is that I'm rehearsing for when I inevitably have to socialize.
Uh-huh.
And when I'm in conversation, I have sort of these like pre-prepared scripts or like I have a repertory of stuff
Uh-huh.
and it'll come across somewhat unnaturally because it's I mean not quite as much now as when I was a kid, but just sort of like it's like all there. And if I don't get it out of my head,
Mm-hmm.
then it's just gonna like it's like leaving food in the back of the refrigerator for months or whatever.
So what I was saying is that when I'd have, I'll have conversations in the head. So it's interesting. You're having conversations with yourself in your head. So it's like two yous talking to each other. Is that
Sort of like it wasn't like the other person wasn't me exactly, but it would just be. I mean,
bouncing things off
I
a
don't want
wall?
this to sound like I'm puffing myself, like a platonic dialogue. Like it would be
Eh,
leading questions, so it's just sort of like sort of linear thought, but
mm.
split into two parts.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so when I have conversations, it's with other people, and I'm trying to, I work some stuff out, and sometimes it's preparing, like imagining what are the different outcomes. Like if I talk to
Mm.
this person and here's what it's like, versus if I say this, or they might respond to it this way, or they might respond to it this way, and I start worrying about all these different possibilities, and that's partly also like anxiety. And I'll have, if I'm going to do something, like I'm waiting in line at the movie theater, and I'm start to preparing like what I'm going to say and how I'm going to order, because I'm afraid of getting it wrong or saying the
Mhm.
wrong thing, or and then and so on. Although that's more anxiety and other stuff, I think. But the conversation in my head, my point was,
Anxiety is a huge part of it, though, because
yeah,
it's sort of like figuring out how to function socially when you're working with that. It's like falling off a bicycle a bunch of times in a row. Like you're not going to
uh-huh.
want to get back on the bicycle at certain points.
Yeah,
That's kind of like when I've kind of gone off the grid for a little bit. I think that was what was going on. I was just like socially exhausted.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting. But when I'm not having conversation with somebody else, and I'm just thinking, I'm just, in my own world or whatever, I'm not thinking in words. And I used to, this is what I was trying, earlier, what I was, when I was trying to come up with the right word, not despondent, but distraught, I'd get really distraught about the fact that I wasn't thinking of words, and like, oh my God, everybody else is thinking in words, and they're able to have these complete sentences and all that, and prepare them, or not prepare them, but think them and say them and all that. And I'm like, I'm not thinking in words. This is awful. Like, this is all so confusing. I don't understand. And actually, now that I think about it, separately from having a conversation in your head, I don't know if everybody does that, but do people think in words? Or when they're thinking, do they always apply words, or is it more like the senses or the ideas are there that aren't connected to them?
I mean, you're never going to get to be able to be inside somebody else's head, unfortunately. But
Right.
I
I mean,
mean,
this
at
is,
least when I think about stuff, and I think when I write prose, it's very obvious that, I mean, to go back to the earlier thing, like thought and speech for me are inextricably intertwined. Like there's a certain amount of thinking that I can only do by talking,
uh-huh.
and uh, as a result of that, because you also you get this like insane photographic memory sometimes with autism, which I got a bit of that,
Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
um, like usually prose that I've written, if it's not like theoretical or criticism, if it's like I'm telling story, like in the Occupy book,
Right.
it's I composed it all speaking, and that's why like I think stand-up comedy came fairly naturally to me when I was younger, because it's all about thinking through speech and kind of editing it through social cues.
Uh-huh.
Um,
But if you're not talking, what is it like in your mind?
it just kind of sounds like me talking. Like I would kind of explain to my ex at certain points that, because she would get exhausted by it, because if your brain doesn't work like that,
Uh-huh.
um I presume at least, like, listening to me talk about something for an hour and a half is probably fairly exhausting. And I would try to get her to understand that I understand that, because that voice is going in my head like
Uh-huh.
24/7, right? I'm used to it at this point, but I also probably have more stamina for it just because
Yeah, yeah.
I'm living with it every day. And yeah, but I tend to think in full sentences. When I have dreams, though, there's a rare, nobody ever talks and there's no language. It's like
Uh-huh.
all, it looks like old dirty photographs in a slideshow almost. Like weird. Um, and uh, yeah, and I think also, like, if you're having conversations with yourself in your head constantly, you just start doing it faster and
Mm-hmm.
faster, because you just sort of you exhaust things socially in your head before you reach them in reality, so you're sort of bored with certain things that you kind of realize later on. It's like, oh, okay, people, um I'm trying to think, like, they're looking for these things, but you don't understand the purpose of them, so you just sort of like steamrolling over them in your head. And I don't know if
Uh-huh.
that makes any sense, but uh, and yeah, like the fast speech.
Uh-huh.
I think most like people that are not necessarily on the spectrum, like not all of them, but they're not constantly conversing or having these kind of fictional dialogues in their head.
Wait, Dan. Now you're underscoring the thing that I would get distraught by, and I still occasionally do, is that you're saying that people do think in terms of words and sentences and stuff. And so now I'm back to like, oh my God, I'm the only one who doesn't.
Well, no. I think it's like, so, with the spectrum, like it can, one of the reasons I didn't figure it out for a really long time is that it tends to be, and I think this goes back to like understandings of autism in like 2009 or so. It, oh man, where was I going with this? Like it's usually portrayed as mathematics, like the person has exceptional skills in like chess or mathematics or something
Right.
quantitative. There's not
Wait,
a lot of talk about like verbal autism, and she totally has verbal autism. Because
yeah,
the
yeah.
weird thing with autism is that like you're either not talking at all or you can't stop talking.
Which is also why she's so great at creating crossword puzzles.
Right.
And it's interesting. I just came up with a metaphor for when I'm thinking, and I say I don't think in words, and sometimes like there's like bits of words, almost like I can see the letters, but it's a soup. It's a soup that has a very thick soup that has there's words in there, but I can't see them, and occasionally I'll see a little bit of it sticking out. So it's imagine alphabet soup, but most of the alphabet has sunk down, and occasionally some will pop up a little bit. And instead of alphabet soup, it's word soup, but they've sunk. And it's swirling and it's swirling. There's an unseen spoon swirling the soup. Yeah, that's kind of what it's like.
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's almost like editing writing. Like I'll have like those kind of conversations in my head, which that doesn't happen quite. Like when I was younger, like I could literally just get lost in my head for like hours at a time, and yeah, they're very repetitive sometimes. Like I'm having the same exchange over and over again to kind of like finesse the wording.
Oh, totally. I know what you're. Well, when I have the different kinds of conversation, but still, yeah. I mean, that's how much of that is obsession.
And that's another part of it, right? Is like it's like you sink your teeth into something and you don't want to let go of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've definitely done that, and I still do that, and act like in a romantic relationship that I don't think she quite like. I was trying to explain it, but it was it's probably kind of weird for her. Like one day, just all of a sudden, I'm taking apart all the electronics in the house and reading everything on how electronics work when I had literally no interest in it 3 days beforehand or something, right?
You've suddenly discovered it, and boom, that's
right,
not your
it's
life.
just like it clicked, and and that's probably kind of like disorienting for somebody who has consistent interest, because it's like, oh, all of a sudden I have to, if I want to understand what this guy is saying half the time, I have to basically take like a high school course in these random obscure subjects every 3 to 5 months or something, right? Yeah.
Again, I'm thinking of these different things that, and some of them are formed ideas, and some of them are just this sort of sense and I was going to say malformed thoughts, unformed. They're not quite formed thoughts, and they're definitely not, mostly not words. But when I start, I discover something, definitely not to the level of you. I mean, yours is much more extreme, but I'll find something, and suddenly I have to figure out everything about this. And I can't stop. And it's interesting. It's not like, oh my God, I can't stop. I can't believe this is awful. It's like, I don't know how it feels like to you. Like, it's enjoyable. I'm doing it because I'm getting a major kick out of it.
I mean, it depends. Like it can kind of, I think another part of it is that you don't have a lot of, I forget the psychological term for it, but it's almost like there's like a webcam delay on you figuring out what your emotional response to something is.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, if I'm emotionally in a good place, it can be pretty enjoyable. It can get a little exhausting sometimes, but then I just, I sleep. And, but if I'm not emotionally in a good place, then it's sort of I mean, I'm sure you've had unwanted. I mean, I think most people have had unwanted thoughts or like repetitive unwanted thoughts at some point in their life.
Absolutely.
And so you figure they're just a lot more forceful, right? When you have unwanted thoughts, if you don't shut them up immediately, they can keep talking indefinitely, and then you can kind of. And when I had like more anxiety problems in my early 20s, like I could totally just fucking spiral out into like an anxiety attack, and I'm just like rambling at 1,000,000 miles a second, not necessarily making any sense.
Uh-huh.
Second time I ever smoked weed, I was like convinced for 3 hours I was having a heart attack and I was going to die.
Oh God. Was that sativa?
Probably. I can't remember. It was that was a nightmare. I was like over at Williams College, and I think that's when I became a Marxist, basically, because I was like flipping out, thinking I was going to have a heart attack and die. And then all these like rich kids at Williams, they came in with like phone cameras and were trying to record me like freaking out on the floor.
Uh-huh.
And I was just sort of like, oh shit, these people have no
There's no compassion.
People. Yeah.
There's no compassion there.
They're going to be working for the CIA and ruling the world, whatever, because Williams is like a huge CIA recruitment ground.
Uh-huh.
And they're just terrible fucking people.
Yeah.
But no, I would have like awful anxiety attack, and I think it's that's part of it, is that your brain is moving, and a large part of coming to terms with it, learning how to leverage it into something positive for me was creating kind of a mind-body dualism. Like if I'm having thoughts, I don't think of them as being. I'm trying to think how to describe it. Like I forget if it's AA or Jacques Lacan that said this, but if your head's racing around, it's sort of like you get this class of unruly kindergartners, and if you don't kind of take a distance from your own thoughts and evaluate them, then you're going to take over the classroom and just destroy everything. And I think that's also another thing, is like there is that, like, your brain is doing things that aren't necessarily in the best interest of your physical health. Your brain kind of thinks it's the boss until you figure out, like, oh, okay, I can actually sort through this, and I am not actually the sum of my thoughts. There's something else there. If that makes any sense.
You're more than the sum of your thoughts.
Right. Because you kind of think, or like your emotional states, right? Because you have this delay on having emotional responses to things, and this would be an issue in the relationship I got out of. That, like, I would get upset about something that happened, and I wouldn't realize I was upset for like 5 or 6 days, and then suddenly I'm upset, and I'm like finally expressing it in some way, and it just kind of comes across as like, wow, this guy's like having completely. He's just randomly getting moody or something, right?
Yeah.
Or like you're holding a grudge or something, and it's just sort of like there's a lot of processing time.
Interesting. I want to say, and I hope I'm not overstepping my bounds, but I realize we're both. Well, you're especially talking about. Well, you brought up several times your relationship. I brought up my ex a few times. Both. They were not just out of nowhere, and it's not like it's Valentine's Day and we're commiserating and saying nasty things about them. It's not at all. We're talking about the spectrum, and we talked about ADHD and thought processes and all, and neurotypical versus neurotypical. But this is the relationships are the context is, or the role of that is about differences and some incompatibilities or not understanding. So it's not that anybody is a good person or a bad person or somebody's at fault and the other, or something
It's
like
not
that.
her fault. It's not my fault, but there's still a problem that needs to be solved. And if it isn't solved, then there's issues. At the same time, I recognize that it's easy to not be angry when you kind of realize like, oh, this isn't something that somebody did to me.
Uh-huh.
It's two moving objects that are crashing into each other repeatedly, or so. It's like I'm trying to think, because it's also kind of a weird disorder where like if your legs don't work, it's not like people expect you to pretend that your legs work for their benefit in social situations. They're sort of like, all right, we got to get a ramp or we got to push this person around to get places. And there is this expectation on, I think one side and the other side, where it's sort of like, okay, to what extent does this person have to recognize that things that I'm doing that seem like social faux pas are not necessarily things I have direct control over? At the same time, to what extent do I have to respect their emotional response to these things, whether or not I intended them? Because that is a large part of it, is kind of offending people by accident.
Yeah. I hear you. Actually, when I do, well, I think mine's a little different. Than I say something and then I suddenly really worry about that I offended them, and I'll ask like, "Oh my God, I can't believe, I'm so sorry," and I'll like, "No, that was fine."
Oh yeah, but there were probably like points earlier in your life where you said something that you didn't think was going to offend somebody, that you thought was like meant well, and then the person like did not take it the way that you thought you intended it or
Right.
intended it.
Hey, remember when I got blocked by William Shatner because of the tweet that I wrote about Leonard Nimoy and Carrie Fisher after she died, and he was really nasty about it, blocked me, but sent the tweet out first to everybody. He sent the tweet out as a quote tweet to his millions of followers, and then blocked me. And then they all responded, like not all, but like I got about 100 responses. Really, some of them like okay, and some of them really mean. There was one actually like that wanted me to die, and I had some conversations, but it was all like I meant it like I was actually sad. It was I was thinking about it earlier, and I don't know if the right word is mourning, but because it felt a little bit like well, two things. One, I find it kind of creepy following people who are deceased. And on Facebook, it's worse. Like I'll have somebody, a birthday will come up and I'll say so-and-so's birthday, wish them happy birthday. And it's like they died 2 years ago. And their web pages are still live. And in this case, it was a little bit like in Judaism, first there's the first 7 days of Shiva where you basically are doing nothing. So people come over and sit with you and they bring food because you're not allowed to cook, and you cover all the mirrors and stuff like that. And then afterwards, and then there's after 30 days, I think that's when the headstone is unveiled. And then after a year, you stop. You're not allowed to mourn anymore after that. The mourning period is over. So it felt a little bit like that. So the mourning period is over. Can't mourn anymore. This is creepy to have dead people in my Twitter feed. I'm going to remove them. I'm sad about it. So I said something about it. And I offended a whole bunch of people because of the way I worded it. And there were a few people actually who said something to me, and I responded to them and said, I really, this is what I meant. I really, and they were understanding. It was nice to have, out of the 100 people, to have like about a dozen people that were actually accepted what I said or understood it. And then there were a few that weren't. And then there was this one person who I went back and forth with constantly, and she totally did not understand. And I was like, and we ended up, I was kind of laughing. I thought it was a fun conversation with her. Because it was clear she kept trying to school me and telling me about, and she said at one point, it feels like I'm talking to a robot. And my response was beep, beep, boop.
I think that's like a good thing that's a thing the movie does extremely well. Like it walks that line between, it acknowledges that her behavior is completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
But it doesn't immediately condemn her for the fact that she's doing these inappropriate things. It's like digging a little deeper, and it's like humanistic. I think in a lot of I think a lot of movies tend to be made out of almost like an unresolved sense of like betrayal or something, or almost like a trauma. Like there's this inability to uh, comprehend people being inappropriate, but still having the possibility of being redeemed in the eyes of society, or having, something of value to contribute.
It's interesting. I was just thinking about, well, a couple of things with the way they portrayed her. It was more like, that's her personality. And I'm using the word off kilter. I don't want to use words like, man, even that's a little bit. I don't want to use nuts or crazy or loony or anything like that. Those are all very pejorative. So the reason I'm using off kilter is, and that's her personality quirks. That's just the way she is. It's a little different from most people. It stands out. It could sometimes be unbearable. But the movie was compassionate towards that. And again, I want to be careful with using words like quirky and off kilter, but I don't know if there's good words to describe it, because so much is portrayed as
a way that people have expressed it to me. Like I think they pick up there's something different about how I'm behaving socially.
Yeah.
And they're not quite sure what it is, and they don't necessarily immediately think Asperger's. And the way I always said it is like, you're always yourself. Like you're not necessarily the easiest person to get along with, but I know that you're not. There's no sense of like a social facade.
Okay.
Which can be taken as sincerity or something. I feel like it's not really I think that was another. I mean, I guess like I've had conversations with multiple people about this, where I don't relate to necessarily to people who have a lot of anxiety about who they are. I felt like my identity was pretty fully formed from a fairly young age.
Yeah. Whereas I have, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I just didn't realize that wasn't a universal until later in life, because I was just sort of like, do unto others as you would have done unto you is not the greatest theory of other minds, or not the most sophisticated theory of other minds,
I have the reverse. I'm trying to avoid the deception is the right word, but I said there's no deception on your end. You are, the way you present yourself. It's not even you're presenting yourself. That's simply that's
what you see is what you get.
What you see is yes. And in my case, I feel like I'm deceptive, but I'm so afraid of people knowing, sort of what I'm really like and what my inner world is like. And I feel like I am putting on a facade, and I have have a really hard time with that. And sometimes, it seems like, oh, I'm really sincere, and I'm really and there's stuff about me that I'll just do it because that's like, and I've learned actually with some of this stuff, like, I should stop hiding that and just be myself in some ways. But no, I mean that's there's parts of it there sometimes.
It's like a weird thing where I think it's one of the only, if somebody doesn't recognize that it's Asperger's syndrome, when I'm talking to them, they can feel like intimidated a lot of the time, or like weirdly, how do I put this? Like they feel kind of insecure, because it seems like, oh, okay, this guy has this incredibly strong sense of self, and he's very confident, when really I'm just talking a lot. And also like the insistence, like a lot of it is getting into stupid arguments, because you sort of you don't necessarily. I mean, the way I always kind of framed it in my head as a kid was like, oh, okay, if people don't respect the truth, then there's going to be Nazis again or something, because I had all these anxieties about Nazis when I was a kid. And so but you don't know how to choose your battles, right? So like somebody will be making small talk, and then you're like, no, that movie came out this date. They're like, who cares, right? Like talk on it.
I've been, so at work, I'm actually stuck on this one thing. I mean, part of it is like some legitimate stuff that, and like I said, I was worried that it's going to come to a head. I was anticipating it, and now it's starting to, and it has to do with some very different styles and of working on some stuff. And mine is very different. And so some of the stuff, and that was part of the thing I said, the process document, and it was a good document, but there's some stuff in there and about it that I think is, in my case, is limiting, because of some ways in which I operate very differently. And it's not that I operate better. That's what I'm saying. It's just very different. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to it. It's the methodology. And for the methodology that's most of the people follow, that's far more common. there's some advantages. I started with disadvantages. There's some advantages to it, and there's disadvantages to it. So they actually pair well together, in a lot of respects. But it's almost like there's sort of the tyranny of the majority. I don't know if I'm misusing that term, but still, there's a bit of that tyranny, and we're like, and this is the way it's got to be, and the conformity and all that. And we're like, but no, I'm different. So it feels a little bit like that too. Like I need to, like, wow, I never thought of it this way, and in these terms, it feels like I'm being asked to conform.
Yeah. Like if I'm making small talk or something, or I'm trying to, like, I don't know if this is offensive, but when I've heard descriptions of like gay or trans people passing, like light-skinned Black people trying to pass as white,
yeah,
it feels reminiscent of like, okay, I'm trying to fake something and I'm not good at it, and like there's this kind of fear of being found out until you come to terms with it, I guess.
Interesting.
And yeah, and like I think a lot of when I was in Boston, that was because I was just sort of like, okay, everybody's got these super high expectations. I just got to figure out how to act like a normal human being, and I can, take the rocket to the moon or whatever. And it's physically exhausting to do that for me.
Yeah.
Which is a hard thing to get across to people because, for them, that's the comfort zone.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned small talk, and I'm like, I never understood small talk, and I couldn't do it. And it was, and I finally, it's really in the last few years only. I could say like, boop, 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 boom. It's only in the last 5 years or so that I was able to teach myself how to do small talk a little bit. I can't stand it. And actually, like, say when you're at work and you're at the water cooler, you're getting your coffee, and somebody says, "Hi, hey Ron, how are you doing?" And I'll start telling them, or "How was your weekend?" And I'll start telling them. And honest, without realizing that, oh no, it was just a polite way of saying hello.
Oh yeah. I used to do that. Like somebody would ask me a question, and I like tell them my whole life story, and then I didn't pick up for years that, oh wait, no, it's like getting pinged on the internet. They're just like, I'm here.
Yeah.
They say that I'm here. Say that you're here.
Right.
And it's it's a difficult thing, and I think like also because there's like common tendencies within Asperger's, but they manifest themselves extremely differently over time. So it's not just like, oh, okay, date another person with Asperger's and they're just going to get all of it. So there is sort of, I think it's like it's a positive and a negative. Like you're, I'm trying to, and actually to say something positive about my prior relationship, and something about miscommunication. I'm confusing to people because there's things I can do very easily that come very difficult. That they're very difficult for some people, but really basic stuff like keeping to a schedule with eating food, sleeping normal hours, maintaining a social life competently. It was all completely just confusing and, borderline traumatizing at points early in my life. I get into this relationship. She was on, we both took the ASPE test. She got, I think, 120 points less than I did. She's like the absolute opposite end of the...
very neurotypical.
Very neurotypical. I learned an enormous amount about just how to exist as a human being by living with her and being able to watch, like, okay, this is what like normal routines and habits kind of look like. This is how quote unquote neurotypical interactions technically go. And I would tell her that. I would be like, if you weren't here, and before she was there, I was like squatting in a building. I was living at this coffee shop, writing a book. I was just getting into stupid arguments with like homeless guys on the street all the time. And, but she wasn't there for that. So she was just sort of like wow, the only thing I bring to this relationship is getting you to eat 3 times a day. Right. And she was like offended by it. At the same time, I didn't know how else to express it because it was like a life-changing
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
being able to just sort of tag along and sort of have an internship with neurotypicality.
An internship, I like that. I was thinking the word modeling, and I think that, there's some modeling going on here, but internship with neurotypicality, I like that. I like that. I
Yeah,
like
and
that a lot.
I
Yeah.
mean it changed my life drastically for the better. Like when I
Yeah.
got to upstate New York, these people that like I recognized. I mean, the other thing was that when you're not reading social cues, you're also not picking up a lot of positive social cues.
Yeah.
So you're sort of like staring at this like silence, right? And I kind of realized like, oh, okay, these people do love me and care about me. I just was not able to comprehend that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't know what the tells were. And I reconnected with a lot of these people, and I feel like my social relationships with them are a lot more stable, productive, and just positive than they were before I was in the relationship.
Well, I see, every Friday night we have Degrassi Club, in which 6 of us get together online and we
Mhm.
watch 4 episodes of Degrassi, the Degrassi, the Degrassi world, Degrassi Junior High, Degrassi High, Degrassi Next Generation,
The
Degrassi Next
DHU.
Class, the DHU, the Degrassi High School Universe.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah.
And watching that
But
show all the way through, I think, was like a huge thing because there's parts of it that are like Next Generation. There's parts of it that are really obvious and kind of stupid, but it's all dealing with like teaching. Because like Linda Schuyler, when she was creating the show, and I think this is what makes it stand out a lot from most other like programming for children or adults. She wasn't looking at it as an artistic project. She looked at it entirely as an educational project.
uh-huh.
And so there's a lot of stuff just kind of going over like basic social mistakes that teenagers make in this
Yeah, yeah.
fairly understanding and forgiving way. And I'm picking up on this, and like my ex is watching me watch this stuff, and she's like, "Oh my god, he's regressed to like the mental state of a child. Like, what the fuck did I do to this guy?" And I'm watching, it's like, oh wow, this is like this is like the strategy guide to the video game that was missing.
You're not regressing to being a child. You're the child who's growing up.
Yeah, because I think that's another thing with Asperger's, that this All About Steve doesn't really get into this because she doesn't come across as particularly. I mean, I'm trying to think. I was on a conversation on a phone call with somebody last night. I was trying to explain it. It's sort of like I'm like a used car. There's parts of me that are drastically older than other parts.
And you got fresh new
Sure,
tires.
Yeah.
The Degrassi Club. It's interesting that what you were just saying. I'm glad that I brought it up. Then that's not why I brought it up, but it's really interesting, and it's great that what it really meant and the impact that it had on you. But well, maybe this is part of it. So now when we're doing Degrassi Club and we're with them, and I didn't know the 4 of the people. You introduced me to them. One I met your sister a couple of times before, and your sister and her boyfriend. But then the other 2, your friend and her boyfriend, her husband.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, I won't name them, but
yeah. I'm avoiding names here, so intentionally. When you try to avoid ever naming names, or maybe occasionally an initial. But my point was, everything you're describing from years ago doesn't come across in the least bit in the conversations and the interactions with the folks that that as we're watching it and talk.
Oh yeah,
I mean, usually
I've known. I haven't known. I only knew her husband when she went on her first date with her husband. She like texted me and she was like, "I'm confused. I can't figure out if I like this guy, but we're hanging out all the time." And I just told her to go for it. And so
and it worked.
Yeah, no, they're like the most functional couple I think I know. And
yeah.
But yeah, she's like incredibly smart, but she has a lot of emotional intelligence. And definitely when I was like at my worst and I was just sort of like having these like spiraling unwanted thoughts all the time, and I just like, I wasn't looking for work, I wasn't making any kind of money, I wasn't, I was just sort of like this drifting angry teenager in my mid-20s.
Uh-huh.
And she talked me through it, and then that was a huge part of it.
Uh-huh.
Because the other thing is that like I used to, like if somebody would get offended, and I definitely had a lot of people who get incredibly offended after some conversation, I wouldn't pick up on it, and then it's just sort of like out of the blue, the person doesn't want to talk to me, and then I would contact them, and I'm like, hey, I seem to be like, it was a different time. I think I used the phrase socially retarded. What did I
Let's
do?
wait.
Right?
Just pause for 1 second, and then so hold on to. Will you remember your thought in a moment?
Yeah, yeah.
What's a better word for that? I know exactly what I mean by that term, but what's a more appropriate term? Because we don't use the R word anymore. Socially,
Atypical,
atypical, underdeveloped. I don't know.
non-normative.
Non-normative. There we go. Socially non-normative. I like that. I like that. Okay, now go back to what you were saying. So you felt like you were socially non-normative.
Yeah, and I realized like, okay, the common thread in all of these like social fallouts is me,
Mhm.
right? Like I think I figured that. I was listening to, there's that great song on that first Liz Fair record, divorce song, and she's like, what is it, like something, figuring out the problem, like the common thread is you. Because up to that point, I was just sort of like, oh, okay, if they can't take a joke, fuck them, right? Which is
Uh-huh.
sort of like the bluffing tactic that Sandra Bullock uses in this movie. It's just sort of
Yeah.
like, all right, these are my instincts. I'm just going to live by them, and what happens, happens.
Yeah.
And but eventually I realized like, oh shit, this is like basically ruining my life. And I would ask the person directly, like, what exactly did I do? Like, you don't have to talk to me after this. Just like, give me some point, give me like the comment card at the restaurant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And most people do not respond well to that. It feels weird to them and artificial, and they
Mm-hmm.
don't think. I mean, I think a lot of them didn't believe I was sincere asking that, and it sounded like I'm. If you're not dealing, if you don't recognize, okay, this is like autism stuff. Uh, it sounds like kind of an insincere ploy to get the person to talk to you again, or like vaguely manipulative.
Uh-huh.
It's like you're playing dumb, and I did not figure that out for years and years. But uh, and the other thing is like if your social relationships don't seem to sustain themselves for long periods of time, you're not it's like riding a bicycle basically. Like you just gotta force yourself to go into social situations until you figure out how to at least like navigate them. And I think my previous relationship was incredibly helpful in that.
You know what? It makes me. It's so nice to hear the way you're describing that and all these positive things about a former relationship. There's a warm part that my heart is feeling kind of warm right now in the way the stuff that you're describing, all these positive
Mm.
things and learning from it,
Hmm.
and all these things that you got out of it. So it's not like, oh my god, that was awful and I hate her. It's like, yeah, I know we had this stuff and and this stuff didn't work and all that, but I learned so much from this and I got so much out of that, and there's things I've changed because of that. So I don't
Oh
know,
yeah,
it's nice
and
to
like
hear.
it was incredibly therapeutic just with those previous social flaws, because that can be like traumatizing at a certain point, because you just sort
Yeah.
of like everybody's all of my social, all my connections to the world are ephemeral,
Yeah.
and the world is just sort of this dreamlike thing passing me by. And just the fact that she was committed, and come hell or high water she wasn't going to leave, like that on its own was incredibly therapeutic.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of, we probably moved in together too soon, because I don't think, I felt like on our first date, like she kind of had an idea, because I took her into the abandoned bakery where I had like the 50 boxes of books lying around. It's like, this is how I make a living. In my apartment. And
Some
uh,
people would run away screaming.
yeah. I mean, I've had a
And
lot
she
of dates
didn't.
where like they just completely, yeah, she found it like, she took it as like, oh, okay, this guy is very smart and he has this very well established sense of self. I didn't realize and this was another thing I was talking about with my friend last night. Like, you don't recognize what you have to offer in those situations, or the fact that everybody else is kind of bluffing too, right? Like, if you don't act like you're abnormal, most people are not going to. They're just going to presume, like, okay, this must be vaguely normal, right? Like it's literally fake it till you make it kind of stuff. And a lot of the stuff that was like negatively impacting the interactions was coming out of my insecurity about the interactions, not necessarily something inherent to like the TISM.
There's something I want to. It's just in line with all this. There's something I want to say, but if I said it to anybody else, I would probably be really offensive. I don't think you would take this as offensive. Well, okay. So what I want to say, and this is again, and you can slap me through Zoom, and so I apologize ahead of time. But I just in line with those, I want to say this.
No.
Like,
What's up?
I imagine it'd be really hard to date you.
Oh my God, yeah. Oh my God, like okay. I know that better than anybody. I've been living with me for 31 years now. I mean, I can be exciting to be around, but excitement can get exhausting at a certain point. And there's also, I think if one person in the relationship is on the spectrum and the other person isn't, it's almost like the person who's neuroatypical, because of the fact that there's only, there's the two of you in the relationship, they're almost like having to pass for having Asperger's for half the time.
In order to connect, or
in order to like communicate.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, it was probably fairly, I don't feel like I'm ever boring necessarily, but
you're not boring.
I can be very difficult. I can be very confusing. And I can get impatient with things sometimes, because like my brain's moving very, like, probably too fast for its own good. And then it's just sort of like, it's like the road runner stopping and checking his watch or something. And that comes across as like a dick move.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a dick move, but it's a thing.
So, I usually, I'm the one that does the editing for the for the podcast, right? Part of it is that we have different styles. So this is a way of me imposing my style. I learned some stuff from you, but there's also the way, so what I'm kind of modeling it on. And you totally like let me have the reins, and you're cool with it, which is great.
Oh yeah, because for me it's like, it's like another filter. So like if I accidentally say something that's going to offend a lot of people, there's at least some kind of filter. Like
I see. Yeah.
Because I'm a terrible judge of that kind of stuff.
So some of the stuff that I remove is like things like that. And it's not just stuff that you say, it's also stuff that I might say or a guest might say. I'm like, ooh, wait, either there'll be a little thing, it's like, wow, that's really insensitive, or we'll talk about something like a marginalized group. They will say something like, okay, that it's an insensitive thing. And again, it's not just you, it's like me or anyone else.
That goes in. I mean, this is more like a personal thing than I think some kind of universal experience of autism. But like, I grew up with edgelord culture. I was like 10 when Napster got huge. People like, my high school experience was defined by people sending E-bombs world links of like gross shit, like top girl shit. Back and forth.
Can you explain what an edgelord is? Because I just heard the term from you. There's my Hebrew coming in. I heard the term for the first time from you, like maybe half a year ago. And I still don't quite get it. I don't know how many times I've read about it, even read articles, and can you explain what edgelord is?
So think of it kind of like, I feel like the 90s and early 2000s were the absolute peak of this. But there was this sense in the culture of things had been repressed in some capacity since the 1950s. The natural progression of society towards becoming more like liberal and modern revolved around defeating ideas of censorship, or at least that's like the sort of rationale behind it. And so you end up with a lot of culture that's produced purely for transgressive purposes or shocking effects. And it's I'm trying to think of like, I mean, the best example was like early 2000s, like E-Bombs World internet videos, right? Like I used to get these there was one where it's like a bunch of like copy pasted heads of people with Down syndrome, like in a flash animation, and they're like in a spaceship, and there's this like horrible song behind it where it's like, people from space, we're not from here, we are the space people, right? And that was like, that was a thing that I saw many times as a teenager, and the humor and quote unquote appeal of it is entirely that it's offensive, and there was a value put on offensiveness as sort of this like defensive free speech on some level, or like there was a cultural cachet in being just sort of broadly against the norms of the culture, or the professed higher ideals of the culture. I think to go back to our Gen X episode, part of that was probably disillusionment with the 60s and the baby boomers selling out. So it's sort of like, all these ideals are stupid, so we're going to poke a hole in it.
We want to make money now.
Right. And
we want to run hedge funds.
Yeah. Like, do you ever see Jackass on TV, on MTV?
Tiny bit.
Yeah, that's like classic edgelord, right? It's just like a guy injuring himself over and over again for laughs.
Although he's not offending anyone, right? Or is he? I don't know. I haven't seen. I barely seen.
I remember parents being incensed about it, like Howard Stern. Howard Stern is a perfect example, like edgelord culture.
It offends the sensibilities.
Like transgressive culture, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like the reason why the reputations of a lot of those like 60s and 70s like exploitation movies are suddenly being rehabilitated is because these transgressive movies that were meant to shock people, that was the only place where you were seeing like actual gay characters in movies, or the only place you were seeing any kind of acknowledgement that these particular things existed, maybe not with the best of intention, but it ends up being just sort of, that is the written record of social attitudes towards this thing at this point in time. And that can have positive effects. People start, it can introduce people to ideas or things that they weren't necessarily going to approach on their own. At the same time, if you take it as a way of life, you end up like 4chan. People on 4chan, that is the epitome of current like edgelord culture is.
Oh God. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That sounds like
kind of go either way.
That's you mentioned 4chan, and so it's an extremely horrendous. Is it to the extreme? It takes it to the negative extreme.
There was a guy on 4chan where he posted like this flashing light GIF onto an epilepsy forum, and then he was claiming that he helped the website because he pointed out the flaw in how they ran this message board. But then a bunch of people got seizures, and that's when that's the negative side of it. And I think a lot of current conservative culture was sort of, because like 90s edgelord culture, it would lean like center left. I don't think it was as progressive as most people took it to be at the time. And then I think like a light bulb went off, and probably like Steve Bannon thought of this. Just like, oh, okay, the Newt Gingrich, like, we're against PC culture thing, plus this like teenager edgelord thing of like kids trying to outshock each other on the internet. That's peanut butter and jelly, right? Like it goes together. Like the two things could very easily merge, and just nobody thought of merging the two things for 20 years. And then we ended up with this giant issue.
Okay. What we ended up with was jelly and rotting peanut butter.
Right. and like when we were talking about Dennis Leary earlier, like the biggest difference between Dennis Leary and Bill Hicks, besides that Bill Hicks actually wrote the jokes.
Just to back up, this is the conversation we had earlier in which you told me about how Dennis Leary stole Bill Hicks's material.
Yeah, if you go back to the first two Bill Hicks records, Relentless and what's the other one? It'll come to me. But yeah, so I worked as a stand-up comic a lot when I was a teenager, and I was working with these older guys that were just sort of like perpetually doing the Northeast US circuit. So a lot of these guys are like 50, 60, they worked with Bill Hicks and Dennis Leary when they were nobodies.
Uh-huh.
And the joke that was that always, because Dennis Leary stole complete bits and his entire persona from Bill Hicks when Bill Hicks was dying of cancer, and then he got a Grammy for best comedy record right about when Bill Hicks died.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's
and the first record, well, okay, if you know what the name of the first record is, you can probably see where I'm going with this, but there was a joke that would go around the comedy clubs. Why is Bill Hicks dead and Dennis Leary still walks the earth? Because there's no cure for cancer, which was the name of the first Dennis Leary record.
That is so incredibly disrespectful, insensitive, horrendous, inappropriate. I don't know how many other of these words to possibly use. And I'll add that I don't think Dennis Leary is funny.
No, Dennis Leary is like, Bill Hicks was using the shocking elements of his humor to challenge people intellectually. You know, there's a lot of stuff about like anti-US imperialism in his bits, you know, but there's also stuff where he just get pissed at the audience and he's like talking in this about the most disgusting, gross things he can think of to piss off the audience, right? And Bill Hicks.
I'm imagining. So I know Bill Hicks, and I've seen a little bit of his comedy, I think, but not a lot. What I'm imagining, the way you're saying, is Lenny Bruce channeling G.G. Allin.
More Lenny Bruce than G.G. Allin, but yeah,
okay.
He's considered like I would consider him one of the kind of heirs of Lenny Bruce.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking Lenny Bruce until you said about the bit about getting mad at the audience, and then G.G. Allin is sort of like this kind of constant fuck you.
Right.
So that's why I was thinking
it was weird because he was slightly insecure about that because he got to a point where, you know, because he was famous for like bashing his teeth in with a microphone, shitting on the audience.
Uh-huh.
And later in his career, he was afraid he was going to disappoint the audience if he didn't take a shit on him. So he would take laxatives before he got on stage.
No kidding.
Swear to God, yeah.
Wow.
And but yeah, so Bill Hicks, he's using this to get it. He has deeply held beliefs, and they're well thought out. And he's using this kind of shock humor to get towards those like Lenny Bruce.
Yeah.
Dennis Leary is entirely about like self-involved contrarianism.
Yes, that's what I was trying to think of now. He's angry.
Right.
And contrarianism is the word I was trying to think of. But
right,
okay, I like that, self-involved contrarianism.
That's the real reason why he became more famous, because he's he's jerking off the audience more. The thing that I always like, because I love, Bill Hicks was a huge formative influence for me. And one of the things that I thought was so incredibly admirable about the guy and Lenny Bruce was that they didn't see the point of comedy as being making the audience like you. And in fact, they kind of had this suspicion of that, right? Because if you're just reinforcing what the audience already thinks, then they're not learning anything. And so they saw this like deeper purpose to comedy. Leary just saw there's this huge contingent of like angry white people.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I agree. Angry white male.
Right. And I mean, same thing with like Bill Maher is probably the worst example. Bill Maher is what I would call like an applause comic.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch any of his specials, the jokes aren't actually funny, but the audience agrees with everything that he's saying. So you hear more clapping than laughing.
Okay.
Versus like a Doug Stanhope comedy special, the audience is uncomfortable and disagrees with him in large. I mean, not so much now because he found his audience, but like those early Doug Stanhope records, the best Doug Stanhope record, Deadbeat Hero, there's barely any laughter. like the audience just sounds incredibly uncomfortable, but these bits are absolutely brilliant. And yeah, and that definitely left an impression of like people. There's a sinister side to desperately wanting people to like you.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Hey, what was the phrase used earlier about Bill Hicks? You said he was transformative in your life or something like that. I'm trying to remember the phrase.
He was a huge formative influence. Like I decided that I was going to try to do stand-up comedy after I watched a bunch of Woody Allen movies when I was 12. And then I founded Bill Hicks. I think my older sister or my brother-in-law, because my brother-in-law is from Texas. So he, like, Bill Hicks is a bigger deal in Texas because he was from Texas. And he passed me this Bill Hicks record. And I listened and watched I've heard every Bill Hicks bootleg, official release, concert video. And that was a huge, when I got to the comedy club and I was working with these people, I was like, holy shit, this guy actually knew Bill Hicks. And like Mike Rizzo, he told me his great story when we were both doing the Saratoga Comedy Club, that, and this is like infamous in comedy circles, but most people don't know the whole story because there's just this video bootleg of it. And if you ever see the video bootleg, it's basically Bill Hicks. He's playing the Chicago Funny Farm. I think it's like 1988, so it's right before he got off drugs. And this woman screams like "Play Freebird" in the middle of him talking about like the U.S. government basically setting up these small countries so they can take their oil.
Okay, I'm laughing inside, by the way, just so you know. Yeah. I think that's hilarious that you did that.
And he just completely flips shit.
Wow.
And he's just screaming like "you cunt" over and over again for like 10 or 15 minutes.
Jeez.
It's, you know, you can tell that he's just like so and that's purely just him like being sick of the audience and trying to be transgressive for its own sake, which he did do on occasion because he was, you know, he was an angry guy.
Yeah.
But so Johnny Rizzo tells me he was the other comic on the bill. It was a week-long set at the Chicago Funny Farm, or a week-long, not a week-long set, but like, you know, he's playing every night at the Funny Farm.
Yep.
And the Funny Farm, for those who don't know, is I think that's the most famous comedy club in Chicago. But anyway, so he makes a bet with the other comics that by the end of the 7 days, he can get literally every person in the audience to walk out. And slowly over the course of the week, he gets more and more. And by the last night, he gets it down to 2 people at this table in the front. And he's just like screaming at them 10 minutes before his set's supposed to end. They finally leave.
Wow.
And the next year, he had to play like 20 or 30 free gigs across the country as basically his apology tour. And I think that's what he went into rehab. Or
really?
Not rehab, okay. But he just sort of, he had, you know, he was a huge drug user for a long time.
Okay.
And he talks about that a lot in his comedy. But
Bill Hicks.
Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know where I was. Oh yeah.
Well, actually,
when I was doing comedy though, like the autism, like accidentally offending people or seeming to have this like deadpan. There are parts of Asperger's that can be weirdly socially normative in a comedy club in ways that they're not in the real world.
Stephen Wright.